welcome to the Donmar Warehouse's Climate Conversation series. My name is Claire Slater. I'm the head of new work at the Donmar, and I am delighted to host this series of conversations between leading artists and leading climate and social justice thinkers. Our hope is that bringing these inspiring people together will help us all reconsider what it means to make theatre in the context of the climate crisis. These conversations have been curated by Zoe Svensson. Zoe is currently working as the Donmar's climate dramaturg. Her research is enabling us, our artists and our audiences, to take this step back and ask, how can the stories we tell and the ways we produce them contribute to a climate-positive future? Joining Zoe today to talk about the Donmar's production Force Majeure is the director of the show, Mike Longhurst. Mike is also the artistic director of the Donmar. Also with us, international climate lawyer and social activist Farhana Yamin. Zoe, over to you.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what has brought us here today. Over this year, as I explore with the Donmar ways of thinking about theatre in the context of climate crisis, we want to ask what's the role for art. And I'm going to quote Ben Okri, who recently wrote a searing piece in The Guardian. He says, "We have to find a new art and a new psychology to penetrate the apathy and the denial that are preventing us making the changes that are inevitable if our world is to survive. We need a new art to waken people both to the enormity of what is looming and the fact that we can still do something about it. There is a time for hope and there is a time for realism. But what is needed now is beyond hope and realism. This is a time when we ought to dedicate ourselves to bringing about the greatest shift in human consciousness. And this is where theatre can play its role, most fully, not only in greening operations, but in exploring the stories that are going to help us understand who we are and who we could be. And what better place to start this series, so this is the first in a series of conversations like this, with the play Force Majeure, which at its centre has a set of family dynamics around control, power, denial and selfhood that I see very much reflected in the wider crisis around how we talk about and how we act on the climate crisis. So I'd like to start by asking Mike to tell us a little bit about the play.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zoe. It's a stage adaptation by Tim Price of Ruben Östlund's film Force Majeure, which tells the story of a family of four, Thomas and Ebba, and their two children, Harry and Vera. And they have come for some quality family time. And we kind of know how that usually works when a family has quality time in a dramatic space. But they need it, and so they have come on a skiing holiday to the Alps. They're a Swedish family, and they are enjoying Beyond the Slopes together. And after some skiing, they go for lunch on a outside restaurant on the side of the mountain, and they watch a controlled explosion that sets off some snow movement, which is a regular occurrence on the Alps to regulate how the snow is settled and to move it safely away to kind of maximise the skiing conditions. And this controlled explosion delivers what initially seems to be a controlled avalanche, and then becomes terrifying as it looks like an avalanche is about to hit the family. And just as it gets to the restaurant, and all the people in the restaurant go into a massive crisis, the father, #spoilers, grabs his phone and his gloves and pegs it, while the mother grabs the children and ducks. And what transpires is it wasn't an avalanche, it was only an avalanche smoke. The real avalanche had stopped further away. But as the smoke clears, I guess the family has to look at these instinctive reactions. And this sort of triggers an existential crisis because Dad comes back and essentially denies what has happened and won't acknowledge the action he took in that moment. And this triggers an existential debate about the roles of the mother and the father in this family. And we watch Thomas's stubborn refusal to acknowledge what's happened and to be in a state of denial until eventually, I guess, it becomes too unbearable. He has to... He finds a way to admit vulnerability, and I hope there is a note of optimism towards the end, as collectively they acknowledge their fallibility as a family and try to imagine a way of being more honest with each other and approaching, I guess, the mountains of future life that are ahead of them in a new way.
And I wanted to ask you, Farhana, in your many, many years of being at the forefront of climate negotiations and the incredible work that you've done in those arenas, do you see patterns of that sort of relationship between control and denial and then its transformation into a more transparent and honest mode at work?
Human beings since they evolved, have basically taken over large spaces of ecosystems. And the acceleration of that has really come as a result of colonialism. So colonialism, patriarchy, and imperialism are the drivers of where we've got to globally right now, with nature changing rapidly in every part of the world, and with huge numbers of what we call tipping points. And that's caused by these very big systems, and they evolved in a co-harmony, really, around 400 years ago in this form, and destroyed many cultures who had up until that point been living more or less in harmony, or with a way of understanding and being at peace with nature. So I think the play actually doesn't go into all of that, but it focuses on the masculinity aspect.
Yes, so the brilliant thing about the play, it seems to me, is that it sort of skewers a certain kind of fragile masculinity that centres on a form of control that can't be maintained in the face of reality. There's a brilliant moment in which masculinity is allied with the ability to drive a car. And that fossil fuel dependency seems to me that it's sort of built into our culture, not only as a matter of pragmatics, but also as a matter of who we think we are. And I loved the line when Matt says to his girlfriend about a young guy who she's mentioned as being kind of more open-minded, family-minded, able to network rather than look after himself. He says, "He can't even drive, he'll save you, as long as it's walking distance or on a bus route. He's the hero we need." And what I love about it is the way that the car is figured as this sort of space of masculine autonomy. It's the sort of psychic space in which our culture operates.
It calls into questions the role also that Ebba, the expectations that she has, and her own view of her desire for her man to be the hero and sort of literally save her children and carry her off on this slope. But I feel actually that's the assumptions that we should question, all of us. Who is the hero? What does a hero look like? In this day and age, are we capable of some kind of heroism? And what would this look like against the backdrop of a changing climate, which we know is killing life on Earth?
I wondered you might tell us a little bit more about the process of making Force Majeure and the kinds of conversations you were having.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think what's so exciting to me about this project and, this sort of the start of this journey that we're going on together is understanding how, as a theatre, we can programme work that is specifically about the climate crisis, but actually how all the work we are doing exists within this context and how we need to be conscious of that. And it's the conversations that I had with you that made me just think about that in relation to this piece. I enjoy the sort of impossibility of trying to bring the Alps to the Donmar stage and trying to put some actual skiing on this slope, and the impossibility of trying to ask the actors to spend 2 hours at this precipitous angle when, every time they put down a glass of wine, it wants to fall over. And, when you're trying to rehearse that with a company, it's a challenge. Like, you are constantly on the edge of slipping out of control. And it's so interesting, the effect that had on the company in trying to rehearse it. What things can I control? Because the director has stopped me being able to control most of the normal things that I can do in a rehearsal process. But I guess the other thing that really made me think about is, there's this beautiful stage direction about the stuff, about the sort of aggressively patterned, bright ski armour that they essentially come out in. And it does make me think about, this is a privileged family that take themselves to an environment where they can test their sense of control, and they can, pit themselves against nature, and they can assume to win that. And the whole production was about trying to, work out how the voice of nature pushes back against their sense of control and their fragile sense of ego and the dynamics that they think protect them and actually are shown to be really wanting. And that this event, this disruption forces them, but does allow them into a new way of thinking. And I think looking at, as we rehearse plays, the sort of gender roles, the family dynamics, what it means to be in denial. I mean, it's a huge part of relationship lives. Denying that I'm the kind of parent that actually smokes, denying that I'm unhappy. We deny so many things to kind of survive the day. And once you pull that thread of actually being honest, it's terrifying. It opens up this space of actually having to be brave. And that somehow feels quite relevant to the conversation we're sort of having on a larger level. So I hope that it does gently kind of prick our consciousness, because this is a conversation about climate dramaturgy, and you go, what does that mean for making theatre and how we approach that? And we're at the start of a journey, and where are we aiming for? And it feels this is a stage of consciousness raising.
Farhana, in your experience of being at the forefront of negotiations, whether there's times when you've very much felt in that position that Ebba finds herself in, of going, but it's completely clear what's just happening or is happening, and you're saying it's not. Is that something that you've...
Yeah, definitely. I think right from the beginning, when the scientists started alerting the world, which is now sort of 40 years ago, and formally, legally, from 1989 onwards, the UN, officially mandated that a convention be agreed. So it's pretty old now, this stuff. But at that time, there was a massive debate between luxury emissions, essentially from the lifestyles of the rich and the richer countries, and what we call necessity. So everyone does emit carbon, actually, all over the world. It's just a fact of life, from eating, from agriculture, from even the bare minimum of life's essentials. But some people emit a huge amount of carbon, and they don't know it, and they don't realize it. And that landscape, where they're going on holiday, where they think they're not consuming anything, really, they're having an experience. It's an experience. The holiday industry says you're not consuming, you're experiencing. That's but actually the flights, flights are an enormous contribution. The whole of that landscape in skiing is manufactured. It's produced and run on fossil fuels. And plus all the paraphernalia that they have to wear, and so it does open up lifestyles in the end. What is our lifestyle if actually our happiness is our ability to buy a week's worth of family time, quality. What about the other 50 weeks? I think our whole culture has assumed that you work really hard, you're not happy the rest of the time. You may basically go away to be happy. But that's separate from the issue of whether that causes happiness. And in relation to your question about negotiations, all of the time, but especially now, and this is one of the more positive things about the negotiations, the issue of justice, of whose emissions are really driving, whose lifestyles are really driving those ecological changes, the devastation, and not letting them get away with it anymore. Whether it's the rich in poorer countries or the rich in richer countries, actually it's a lifestyle issue. And, there are some very rich people in India and China, as, the world catches up essentially with a set of values and a way of running our economy, and a set of expectations that are built into what we want that are toxic, full stop, and that is about in the end, the DNA of capitalism has now been exposed as completely not friendly to nature. And so the people who are protecting nature in the real world now are also diminished. They're not seen as valuable. So the people who I worked for at COP26, and I have worked for, are indigenous people who are literally, still safeguarding most of the world's biodiversity, still looking after and trying to fight off mining companies, extractive industries, trying to stop, more land grabs, more soya being planted, more palm oils being, all of which find themselves in our shampoos, in our clothing, in our biscuits, in our meat, actually. So that's where most of the soya goes. It goes into feeding, pigs and chicken, and and reducing the cost of those. So I think, the issues of that truth moment, which happens here, and when the video moment happens, is happening much more widely. And the more that theatre, the more that the world of art helps absorb that, do that in ways that settle, produce discomfort but also change is great. And I think that that's what we're seeing, and this play is very good actually at doing that. So, legally, as I'm a lawyer, the word force majeure is something you learn in term 1 of a law class, and it is an event where actually your contractual obligations, you're released from them, and there is no question asked about liability, like whether it was your fault. All fault is taken away at that point, because it is an event that is deemed as an act of nature or an act of God, or it's something outside of your control. And that's why it's interesting that in this play, they're called on really to release themselves from the roles and expectations that have built up, that are part of, as I say, patriarchy and capitalism. But they don't do that, or they start to do it in very different ways, and with, resistance and anger and, a little bit of, at the very end, a little bit of acceptance that they need to change. But actually that's what force majeure should make us do. And right now that's what the scientists are asking us to do as societies, to stop, to release ourselves, to rethink, to reimagine a better world.
No, it's brilliant. It gets us right to the heart of it. Actually, it's about understanding that maybe it's not about sacrificing that because we're going to be good and not drive a car or whatever. It's much more about how do we reframe what we feel success actually looks like. I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that in relation to the Paris Climate Agreement and your work on getting to the agreement to include the net zero emissions, because it seems to me that was like a really key to the world. It was a really, really key moment of transition into a different recognition of what might be necessary. So rather than the world going, we'll just do a little bit less, it suddenly changed the dynamic and had a sort of direction. I wondered if you'd sort of tell us a bit about what it felt like to be in that process of achieving that.
Yeah, I mean, it's 6 years on now. So in the Paris Agreement, which was negotiated in 2015 and actually took 6 years. We were supposed to agree a treaty back in 2009, and those treaty negotiations all collapsed. And so actually it was complete chaos, because we were, part of why we're so behind is that those negotiations collapsed, and it took 6 years to put Humpty Dumpty legally back together again. And during that moment, I had this, I was getting more and more burnt out and tired and frustrated, having been in these negotiations since 1991. And I guess, like, fast forwarding to why then did I join Extinction Rebellion and, take part in non-violent civil disobedience? Well, because by 2018, it was absolutely obvious nobody was phasing out anything. The UK hadn't, put in law it now has a net zero target by 2050. It didn't have that. They came back, the negotiators and the governments, did nothing and said we don't have to do anything. So I felt this huge achievement that we'd made. The small islands who I worked for was just ignored, actually. And that's what led to the rise of actually, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg, a lot of civil disobedience, which then exploded, around 2018, 2019 onwards, including many theatres actually and artists who sort of declared an emergency. And I feel that that's what's given the push now to companies and the financial institutions to take seriously that target. And that's why at COP26 you had, huge numbers of companies and countries finally saying that they were going to do net zero by 2050, but still not enough, and not enough of them putting forward actual plans, and not enough putting forward plans for the next 5 years. It's great to get a commitment to doing something in 30 years' time, but it's much more important that we do something right now. So it's been a mixed bag in terms of personal validation and feeling proud, but also feeling intensely depressed and frustrated and thinking, what do we do next? I do feel like Thomas sometimes. I feel like running away. Just like I've done my bit. I just want to, I left. Well, I've gone back to the negotiations, but for a while I left. And part of it is I couldn't look then my client, who was the president of the Marshall Islands, in the eye and say, one more COP's going to fix it. And that was a huge thing for me, thinking my profession has failed. My whole life has been about negotiating these, not allowed to swear, treaties and they haven't delivered. And I can't look this woman who is, the head of state of one of the most vulnerable coral atoll nations, where the highest point of the island is a bridge, which is 2 meters high. Most of the islands are less than a meter high. And tell her that we're going to save her. The COP's going to save her. Action's going to save her and her. And I think that many of those more vulnerable cultures are also cultures that are not victims. They are fighters, and they have resisted, and they have been part of these heroic struggles over hundreds of years to throw off colonialism. These very people, the president of the Marshall Islands, Hilda Heine, then said, Farhana, climate change is one of the newest tragedies that we've coped with and, have fought against and will carry on fighting against. They were bombed and had nuclear weapons tested in the Marshall Islands, for example. So these are people of great resilience, strength, imagination, courage. They're not just victims. And that is coming through in the negotiations, and it's coming through with an absolute fierce demand for social justice, climate justice, migrant justice, for issues like loss and damage, which was one of the biggest issues discussed in Glasgow. Didn't quite get enough money, but actually Scotland, made as the first developed rich country, broke ranks actually, and pledged money for what we call loss and damage, which is an acknowledgement of loss, of grief, of acceptance that damage has happened, which legally all the other rich countries are absolutely terrified to admit to, a bit like Thomas. You cannot admit that actually what's happened. So they'd rather deny it and cause another hurt, which is the hurt of injustice for having, whether it's wildfires or tidal, saltwater intrusions or hurricanes or what you're seeing, to not acknowledge that that is also happening is a worse, it will get less technocratic and much more about these bigger issues. And again, that's why we need storytellers and people to care about that, to care about the people and the stories and the values that are being called upon, and to pick up the pieces of a shattered, frankly, I mean, that's what gives me hope, is that I feel like more and more people realise that we're at the end of a 400-year cycle. Like, we are really at the end, and that's what this COP for me was very significant. It was in Scotland. Scotland was the birthplace, and most of the architecture and the underlying innovations, engineering-wise and intellectually, are from Scottish writers and engineers and thinkers and philosophers. So it's very apt that actually COP26 was in Scotland, and it was Scotland that basically apologised and said, yes, we're ready and willing to sign up and admit that 400 years of damage came, it's happening. So things are shifting.
And what you have been doing since is moving more towards sort of imagining and modelling and story making, right? As I understand it from your work.
I've said, we need more storytellers than scientists right now, actually. And I think that's why I'm here. And I'm spending in my own personal life less attention on the legal process, the diplomatic process, and more on spaces and processes and people and individuals who can nurture and nourish that appetite for change, and that appetite for deep change, the muscle that we need, the imaginative muscle as well as the legal muscle to pivot away, because half the time we can't imagine what our future would really look like.
I think sort of theatre can be a space in which we can imagine ourselves as something other than the consumer, and actually largely in public spaces we're mostly addressed as consumers, we're rarely addressed as citizens, and that's a really, I think, an interesting dynamic to think about in relation to the stage and to like how it boils down into those intimate relationships and those questions of power.
Well, as you say, I mean, it feels like the fundamental. This is about change, isn't it? And the fundamental ingredient of drama and character is change. It's like, who am I, and who am I trying to become, or who do I become over the course of a series of events? And we know that change is so hard, isn't it? But I hope there is power in stories that we discover, or that we tell each other, or that we commission, that analyses that fundamental thing. How do we as humans step up to change?
It's often when people think of climate and theatre. They think of a theatre play that tries to convince an audience either that climate change is happening or that they should do X, Y, or Z, or that people want to come away with a message about now I need to go and do my recycling or whatever. And of course the theatre doesn't really, and art doesn't really work like that. I think what you've just described actually is much more the space that we're in, which is how do we find spaces in which we can look at ourselves in ways that can be terrifying actually, and listen to one another and work out who we might be, and also process the levels of anxiety and grief actually that you encounter once you really start to understand what's going on. So when we live in a culture that is largely one of denial, so we talk a lot about it now, but like when you walk around London, the way that the construction industry works, whatever, there's nothing in our visual environment that is telling us that we're in we're on the brink of total planetary collapse. It all seems kind of fine. So even when the floods come and there's a momentary moment where we're like, oh, it's not fine really, it's sort of, as soon as the flood has ebbed again, we're sort of back in that mindset. And I think the theatre is the place that we can start to kind of re-engineer, rather than try and convince someone of a single thing. That is, in a sense, more the place of a climate negotiation, isn't it? Interestingly, perhaps a good note for us to end on. You kind of wonder what would happen to that family if everyone just went, oh, let's just agree with him, it's fine. Like, where would that, that's sort of the culture we're in, right? It's like it's too exhausting to keep disagreeing with someone's construction of reality that is just wrong. But it's exhausting to live, like the cognitive dissonance in living in like double realities is also very, very troubling. So thank you very much for that really like fascinating and thought-provoking conversation. So I hope if this conversation can provoke people to make relations and patterns and analogies between what they see on stage and what they see in the wider world. It's been a really brilliant conversation.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mike, Farhana and Zoe. You've been listening to Climate Conversations at the Donmar Warehouse. See you next time when we talk about our next production, Henry V.